take to the podium to welcome you to the second event in the Graduate Institute's summer series, The Phenomena of Modern Life and the Future of Liberal Education. This evening's event, which I understand to turn on the question of the shape of the education that makes a person free, takes place on a day important in this nation's own struggle for the freedom of all, Juneteenth. And I'm confident that our conversation, conducted in the spirit of civic friendship, will be, in its own small way, a tribute to the Democratic Republic, which, for all the flaws that have marred and continue to mar it, makes conversation like this possible. In a moment, I will welcome to the podium Mr. Jonathan Badger, who will deliver a set of opening remarks, after whom Mr. Patrick Coleman will speak. After both have finished, I will ask a question or two of them here at the rectangular table, but we will soon open the floor to questions, and I'm grateful to Mr. Al-Janabi, I should say, who will serve as floor MC and pass the mic around. I hope to pursue as natural a conversation as this format allows. I'm very grateful to Mr. Badger and Mr. Coleman for helping the college community this evening and on many occasions in the past, especially in Mr. Badger's case, help the college community think about what I take to be a set of related questions. First, are there phenomena that are distinctively, emergently modern? Second, if there are, does the new program prepare our students to confront those phenomena in a spirit of freedom? And third, if it does not, are there ways of envisioning changes, admittedly at the margin, changes that would allow for a more liberal encounter with those distinctively, emergently modern phenomena? I fully concede that this may not even be the right way of asking the relevant questions, but I do think that there is and has long been disagreement within this community about the answers to questions like these. And I take this evening to be an opportunity to learn with and from one another, to think still more deeply and imaginatively about this singular community of learning, St. John's College, and its shape for the future. Mr. Badger.
When I first came to the college in 1996, there was an enormous tree on front campus, close to the Bar Buchanan Center. This tree actually had a name, the Liberty Tree. Legend held that there were 13 Liberty trees in the British colonies of the New World in the late 18th century, at which the conspirators, who later became known as the Founding Fathers, regularly met to discuss their project to overthrow British subjection and found a new regime. The St. John's Liberty Tree, a majestic tulip poplar, was already 350 years old when the American founders stood beneath it. It endured lightning, fires, tornadoes, and even vandalism over the next 2.5 centuries, and finally succumbed to irreparable damage from a powerful hurricane in 1999. After 600 years, the tree's time had finally come. I remember standing under the hulking mass of the cracked trunk with a colleague, Nina Hagney, as we acknowledged the significance of the moment. She remarked that this tree was alive while Chaucer was writing Canterbury Tales. This led me on a trail of thoughts. I don't know what surrounded the tree when it first sprouted, but 3 centuries later, St. John's College grew up around it. Then, a century later, the ground it was rooted in became the United States of America. And around a century and a half after that, it saw the dawn of the new program. And it stood there in solemn silence, an object of admiration and wonder for another 6 decades, through World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam, the Civil Rights Movement, the Sexual Revolution, the Clean Air Act, the rise of computers, and the formation of what we now call the Internet. Not to mention the internal combustion engine, radio, TV, fast food, thermonuclear weapons, the emergence of pop culture, genetic engineering, and space exploration. The Liberty Tree held its ground steadfastly through events that we might call transformative. On the other hand, we might qualify this fact by insisting that while these changes were certainly real and even important, they were finally merely incidental, not transformative. The big things, the great questions of human life, of nature, of the human relationship with the divine, these fundamental realities were unchanged through all of these historical curiosities. And while late modern developments may be interesting in a superficial way, they are not proper objects of study for a program of liberal education. Or, if we do deign to discuss them, the books we currently read convey everything we would need to discuss these phenomena in their essential character. One of the basic elements of our discussion this evening is liberal education. We're basically asking, does liberal education evolve? Does it change in a way that is somehow correlated to changes in its surrounding culture? In order to be rigorous with this question, we might reasonably observe that before we can address the question, we should first be clear about what we mean by liberal education. I'm not going to attempt this now, and I'm not suggesting that we take that on. What I will observe in this context are examples, more or less exemplary, of liberal education as a way of framing the question of evolution. Aristophanes gives us a lampoon of a program of study instituted by Socrates himself, in which anemic youths contemplate the things aloft, as well as the innards of insects, and they learn to weave words in a fashion that undoes conventional norms. They are portrayed by Aristophanes as focusing on abstractions in a way that ignores the realities of the world they actually inhabit, and thereby become either ridiculous, corrupt, or both. Plato, by contrast, gives us a less ridiculous presentation of philosophical education in Book 7 of the Republic. While there don't seem to be books involved in this education, it is a fairly vivid program of study, beginning with music and gymnastic, proceeding through number and arithmetic, geometry, and the as of yet undiscovered science of solid geometry, then astronomy, music again, and then finally something called dialectic. Rich though this education would seem to be, it could not possibly include Euclid, Ptolemy, or Aristotle, and obviously Shakespeare and Kant would be pretty far off program. Evidence suggests that there were programs of study loosely based on this old paradigm in the medieval schools. And while we might recognize the form of such study, we would quickly notice quite a bit of difference in content. While Aristotle, Euclid, and Ptolemy were well represented in the medieval schools, quite a bit of literature we take for granted would not only be absent, there would be no analog to it. The novel had not yet been invented. Natural science had not become mathematical and had not yet cast its lot with fundamental laws of motion. The only Platonic dialogue anyone knew about was Timaeus. So we can expect that no one in the medieval schools talked about Meno or Lady Macbeth, let alone Hegelian logic or the will to power. In 1620, Francis Bacon published Novum Organum, in which he proposed a method of scientific inquiry that included amassing tables of data, conducting experiments, proposing and testing hypotheses, and employing inductive reasoning. He imagined adopting this method would, for the first time in a millennium, result in advances in the natural sciences. Still, no program of study in the 17th century would have included Novum Organum. At some point, however, curators of liberal education judged that something big was happening in natural science, and they recognized that understanding this development could be advanced by reading Bacon. As we move a little closer to the present day, we have the luxury of looking to our own history for some clues to the way liberal education evolves. Tench Francis Tillman wrote a book called The Early History of St. John's College. I'll draw from this in some of what follows. In the late 18th and well into the 19th century, the St. John's program had a strong emphasis on elocution and rhetoric, and even penmanship. Students read Gregory's Letters on Literary Taste and Composition, Campbell's Rhetoric. They read Quintilian, Cicero's Orations, and Walker's Lectures on Elocution. At some point, obviously, these skills were abandoned, or at least insofar as they were deemed worthy objects of explicit programmatic study. In 1792, the 1792 curriculum included the reading of Morse's telegraphy. One could imagine that at the time, the technology of the telegraph seemed extremely important for an educated young man to understand. Principles of navigation were studied in the early days of the college, as was astronomy. As time passed, however, these studies began to seem less clearly necessary for liberal education. In his book, The Education of the Founding Fathers, James Walsh draws attention to the high status of syllogistic disputation in 18th century education. The instructor assigned a student a philosophical or literary topic to defend or refute in Latin using classic rhetorical concepts. The student was required to follow strict rules, inclusion of major premise, minor premise, and conclusion, in the construction of arguments to prove or disprove claims. This was required at Harvard and William and Mary. St. John's also required syllogistic disputation in 1789. But by 1806, the practice had been abandoned and replaced instead by the study of forensic disputation, as opposed to syllogistic disputation. It was similar in form, but conducted in English and far more free, allowing rhetorical flourishes. Forensic disputation might be more familiar to us as formal debate over social or political proposals. This too represented a shift in the aims of liberal education. Tillman remarks that in the 19th century there was a wave of medievalism sweeping across Europe and North America that fostered a keen interest in early and Middle English and is credited with producing the pre-Raphaelite poets. St. John's responded to this wave through the effort over several decades of Corson, McDowell, and Humphreys, who introduced a study of the great English literary heritage. It was at this point that the program incorporated what Tillman calls a philological study of the English language by means of medieval and Anglo-Saxon literature. St. John's students began reading Beowulf and the Gothic Gospels. In 1866, Shakespeare and Milton were first added to the program. By the mid-19th century, there was a decided presence of political economy and constitutional law in the program. Evidences of Christianity and military science were part of the program throughout most of the college's history. These studies were so pronounced that Tillman calls them the St. John's landmarks. Then, as most of us know, something remarkable happened here at St. John's in the early 20th century, the new program. In a document attributed to Scott Buchanan by Winfrey Smith, written in 1935, a few years prior to the founding of the new program, Buchanan affirms that the liberal arts were invented by the Greeks, but improved during the following 20 centuries. The question for us might be, is that improvement ongoing, or has improvement now reached perfection? At almost every point in most programs of liberal education through history, at least for the past 4 centuries, new authors were routinely added. Hobbes, Locke, Publius, Rousseau, Jane Austen, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Lobachevsky, Einstein, Schrödinger. Obviously, these authors were gradually added long after the establishment of modern liberal education as such. At the time of the founding of the new program in 1937, there were 7 works on the reading list written within the previous 40 years, and 2 written within 30 years. A few years later, other early 20th century works began entering into senior seminar, such as Conrad and Faulkner. Dewey's Human Nature and Conduct and Whitehead's Adventures of Ideas were not yet 2 decades old when Johnnies began reading them in seminar. And our seniors began reading Heidegger while this philosopher still walked the earth. We can see then that at the time of the founding of the new program, and for several years afterwards, works as recent as 17 years were included in the reading list, and works as young as 30 years were almost routinely added. But then something changed. After 1944, with only a single exception 5 years ago, the minimum age for inclusion grew to nearly 90 years. All of this suggests that liberal programs of study not only rightly change over time, but also such change does not require centuries. Works can be recognized as worthy of inclusion fairly soon after their publication. Admittedly, this is rare, but it poses a challenge to the view that books must be antiques to be considered great. Our seminar reading lists end in the 1940s. The question we should confront is, have there been any fundamental transitions or transformations in how we think and live over the past 80 years, the foundations of which we might find in poetical or philosophical writings proximate to these transformations? Perhaps the answer to this question is no. One might argue that in terms of the sort of questions we would discuss in a place like St. John's, life today is pretty much the same as life in 1940. We can't deny that there have been great shifts, and it does seem plausible to me that one might argue that something fundamental is at stake in some of these cultural changes. I am not prepared to make that argument, but I am struck by the possibility. As a preliminary to this question of fundamentality, here are some sincere questions conjured by some of the developments of the past 8 decades. What are the limits of sexual equality? What role should race play in the formulation of law and policy? To what extent should technologies penetrate into bodies, organs, cells, genetic material, into DNA itself? To what degree does biological nature suggest barriers or guides to policy? With respect to gender, sex, and the breeding and rearing of children, what are the ethical principles that properly guide the contemplation of the power to bring about the end of the world, such as the power granted by thermonuclear weapons? If industrial activity is permitted to alter the natural environment, is this just another feature of life on Earth, as natural as beavers making dams? Or does heavy industry constitute a rupture in nature? Is there an ethical imperative to preserve the chemistry of the atmosphere and the ecological equilibrium of this particular epoch in the planet's history? Or should human life order its activities according to its own inclinations, convenience, and prosperity? Do environmental imperatives finally reduce to human concerns? Or are there ethical principles that transcend the human good? What are the epistemological and political implications of instantaneous global communication, global media, a global community, universal access to all knowledge and all pseudo-knowledge? What do we really mean by intelligence, and to what degree is it properly situated in human biology? Perhaps these questions are just not deep or interesting enough to merit our attention. Or, if they are, perhaps Plato, Aristotle, and the Hebrew Bible give us all we need to discuss them to the fullest. On the other hand, if we do find these questions to be worthy, perhaps there are deeply interesting texts that see these questions from closer up and that have done some of the heavy lifting already. Might such readings, if they exist, be a boon to us in our endeavor to understand the world we live in? The youngest book in the seminar reading lists was written 80 years ago. Other than a few stretches in what we often call the Dark Ages, there are no other 80-year gaps between books on the seminar reading lists. Perhaps the current long interval is just a pause in intellectual life, some sort of new dark age. If we do feel that we have entered a dark age, that in itself would seem to be a very interesting topic for discussion and, paradoxically, suggests a fundamental shift. On the other hand, maybe this is really the end of the line. Perhaps after 20 centuries of improvement, liberal education is now more or less perfected, and for all time to come, no new works need be added to our reading lists. Perhaps some of us may, in fact, judge that the era of monumental achievement in poetry and philosophy is now complete, and that the Liberty Tree indeed saw this monumental era through to its end. I'll now turn it over to Mr. Coleman.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I thought I would just use my time to just talk about a book that, I don't know, jumped to my mind when Mr. Boyle told me the ideas he was having for the summer lecture series. So I want to talk, I know the Graduate Institute students, I think, don't read this book. But I want to talk just a little bit about Ptolemy's Almagest. And just for background that I think is at least a little bit relevant, since I'm sort of just talking, I want to talk also about the questions I find myself asking when I read the Almagest. It might be just helpful to let you know. So I've been a tutor for 3 years, and before this I did a PhD in physics. And I hadn't read the Almagest until becoming a tutor. And reading it in freshman and in sophomore math tutorial. And I was really surprised, I think, by how recognizable in some ways Ptolemy was to me. He felt like he was doing the same sort of thing that I was doing when I had been studying physics. So I'm just going to talk a little bit, and I'm going to probably give some quotes from the first chapter, first section of the Almagest, just to talk about some of the questions that Ptolemy raises and that I think I find in myself when reading him. So one of the things that he does in this right at the beginning of the Almagest is Ptolemy says that he follows Aristotle in dividing theoretical philosophy into 3 branches. And just, I'm going to use Perry's translation. I'll be quoting from Perry's translation of the Almagest. And the three branches of theoretical philosophy are the natural, the mathematical, and the theological. He says that the theological is about, quote, the first cause of the first motion of the heavens. He says the natural, quote, tracks down material and ever-changing quality concerning white, warm, sweet, soft, and the like. And he says that the mathematical, quote, reveals quality in terms of forms and motions, inquires into figure, quantity, and size, and furthermore, place, time, and the like. So Ptolemy says that mathematical philosophy, the mathematical branch of theoretical philosophy, falls between the theological and the natural. And he says the reason why, quote, it not only can be conceived of both with and without perception, but also is a property of all existent things simply, both mortal and immortal. He argues that the theological branch and the natural branch are, and this is, again, is Perry's translation of the word, conjecture rather than scientific knowledge. Quote, we thought that one might call the other two kinds of theoretical philosophy conjecture rather than scientific knowledge. The theological, because it is utterly suprasensible and unobtainable, and the natural, because of what is unstable and obscure in matter. And he goes on to say, but the mathematical kind alone, should anyone attend to it carefully, would provide certain and steadfast knowledge to those who practice it, as its mode of proof arises through indisputable paths, arithmetic and geometry. So there's just a few things maybe that stand out to me in these quotes, just in this the very beginning of the Almagest, that seem to me just very good questions, and maybe I would say timely questions, given what we'll be talking about tonight. One is just things surrounding perception and sensation. I find this question compelling. What is the role of perception in our attempts to understand the world around us? Is it a mark against a theory if the theory goes beyond perception and principle, says things, makes claims that simply can't be perceived? Is it a mark against a theory if it's unable to go beyond perception and principle? Mathematics, to Ptolemy, has this ability to be found, perceived, found in bodies, but also be able to be thought about apart from them. This question seems to me just as timely as ever. Theoretical physics, arguably in places, has already maybe departed from perception. It's not clear to me that it hasn't. Certainly is, in some ways, very, very clearly trying to do so. Another topic I find here is the question of certainty. What is the role of certainty in our attempts to understand the world around us? Is there any value in conjecture? If conjecture can be the word we use for studies that don't simply give us certainty, that end all debate, everyone who looks into it agrees now. If we are lacking this, is that a strike against that kind of knowledge or study? Is mathematics certain in the way that Ptolemy suggests. Yeah, I'd be interested to hear when the semester ends, the math and science tutorial, after having read Lobachevsky, how they feel about this idea that math is simply certain, that arithmetic and geometry are indisputable, that no one can disagree when they study these. And is mathematics the only route to this certainty? Certainly, I think it's a opinion you'll find today, but certainly one worth thinking about seriously and critically. Is mathematics the only route to certainty? And what kind of certainty does mathematics give us anyways? Another question, it seems to me, is just the question of the heavens. Do the things around me seem unstable and obscure, as Ptolemy says, that the natural branch of theoretical philosophy, that these things simply are unstable and obscure because of their connection with matter? Does that seem right? I think one of the things with Ptolemy that seems valuable is that we're not so much today tempted to read Ptolemy as doctrine, as just everything he says is true, and it's true because he says it's true. I think it's good. I don't think Ptolemy wants us to read him this way, and I think we're, in some sense, because of time and our distance from him, quite immune to that temptation when we read Ptolemy. But I think that the way Ptolemy divides and sees the heavens as compared to the things on the earth is an interesting question. If we no longer think that the heavenly bodies are fundamentally different sorts of bodies from earthly bodies, where does that leave the distinction that he draws between natural philosophy, the natural branch of theoretical philosophy, and the mathematical branch? Is everything now, if Ptolemy were among us today, would he say everything now is natural philosophy? Or would he say perhaps everything now is mathematical philosophy? Does this distinction still ring true to us today in some way, perhaps a different way? Another quote from the Almagest. And indeed, this same discipline, that's the mathematical branch, would more than any other prepare understanding persons with respect to nobleness of actions and character, by means of the sameness, good order, due proportion, and simple directness contemplated in divine things, making its followers lovers of that divine beauty, and making habitual in them, and as it were natural, a like condition of the soul. Yeah, I find this passage really striking. It seems to me, it raises the question, why study the heavens? Maybe why study science at all? Why study the world around us? Some, I think, today might say for the sake of technology, what we can do with that knowledge, it can be useful to us. Perhaps for the sake of knowledge itself, perhaps having and possessing this knowledge is valuable. Striking to me, Ptolemy seems to want to say it's for the sake of beauty, and seems a timely question. Should we be studying math? Should we be studying science for the sake of beauty, for the sake of making ourselves lovers of the divine beauty and order that we find in them? I think I wish this view was more common than it is. I was happy to find it as a tutor here. It didn't seem like a common thought in our times today, but I don't know why it shouldn't be. So the last thing I want to do just with this time here before we sort of continue moving on in our discussion is just give this image that I find a really helpful image, and it's sort of nice maybe how it resonates with Jonathan's image of the tree, the Liberty Tree. I'm sorry, Mr. Badger's image. So in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus tells the parable of the sower, in which a sower goes out sowing seeds, and he sows the seeds in many different kinds of soil. And the seeds grow or fail to grow, depending on the soil that they're sown in. And he later, in explaining this parable to his followers, tells them that the seed is the word of the kingdom. I really like this image. The seed is the word. I think that when we read books together and talk about them as we do, that the words we find in the books are like seeds to me. At least this image seems to capture something of my experience of them. And I also really like this parable because it seems clear, I suppose, to me that we're the dirt. The seeds aren't us. We're the dirt that the seeds get planted in. And so it seems, that when we read these books, we are planting seeds, or seeds can be planted within us. And they can grow or fail to grow depending on how we receive them, on what kind of dirt we are. And so I guess at least these thoughts just make me think something like we are the timely component in a liberal education, or at least we can be. That I can read, in my case at least, the Almagest, a very old book. But I find in it questions that seem to me quite timely. And they're timely not because Ptolemy knew the situation of our world, but because I do, and I'm trying to be thoughtful and reflective about the world that we live in. And so when these seeds, I suppose, get planted in us, that they can, I suppose it seems to me something like there's a way in which the challenge is for us to make them timely. And so I don't think I'm proposing a clear answer to everything that we want to discuss, but I think I wanted to sort of offer this image and these thoughts about the Almagest because there's sort of things that came to my mind in thinking about the question of timeliness and the program and what we do here at St. John's. So do I hand it over to you now? Okay. Thank you.
Again, thank Mr. Badger and Mr. Coleman for starting us off. Mr. Aljanabi, Mike's here at the round table, rectangular table. Sound good? Great. I thought I'd start by trying to draw out what seems to me an interesting difference, at the risk of trying to pit the two of you against one another, which I am not trying to do, but an interesting difference in the level of generality of the kind of question that you both find apt for a liberal education. So what I mean by this is something like the following. Mr. Badger, at the beginning of your remarks, I thought you posed a series of questions. I'm not going to remember them all, and you should correct me if I get any of them wrong, but something about the human being's relationship to the divine, that was one on the list, and I think you ended up saying something like, maybe for questions of that sort, the Hebrew Bible, Plato, Aristotle, and others are sufficient. And so I would imagine that the term I'm using to describe questions is that those are questions of a high order of generality. Maybe that's not the right way of putting it. But by the end of your remarks, you had that list of questions that seemed to me much more specific and much more determinate. Questions about thermonuclear war, questions about DNA and what kinds of technologies may or may not be able to operate on it. those seem to me to be of a different order of generality than the questions with which you began, and it makes sense that for questions of that more determinate, more specific sense, you would imagine that perhaps different resources, different books are needed. But now to bring Mr. Coleman into the conversation, I thought that Mr. Coleman's remarks suggested that for him, the kinds of questions that get asked in a liberal education were closer to the questions with which you, Mr. Badger, began. Questions about, in Mr. Coleman's words, the nature of perception, the nature of certainty, the nature of the heavens and the heavens' relationship to natural objects. So those seem to me quite similar to the kinds of questions with which Mr. Badger began, but very different from the kinds of questions with which Mr. Badger ended. And so I was wondering if the two of you could say a bit more about how you understand the nature of the generality of the kinds of questions that one takes up in a liberal education.
Would you like me to go first?
Would you? Yeah.
Sure.
As I said, my hope is that this can be as natural as the format will allow, and maybe that will be distinctly unnatural, but we'll do our best.
I don't know that I mean, the question is broad, and I don't know that I can go straight to something with it, but I'll just say a few things and see if it is getting at the question. The way I sort of tried to lay out a generalized history of liberal education, which was far from complete, but just to sort of give some broad strokes and the kind of things that we might encounter if we were seriously looking at that. What's clear is that new literature comes into the process. Now, does that happen because the questions change? I don't know. I could, even though what we speak of as timeliness is going to be true for any of the books, let's just choose Homer or Plato as examples. I don't think there will ever come a day where these books are not enormously relevant to anything we might discuss. So that's not really at issue for me. But there did come a day where the mathematization of nature became an endeavor, and people wrote about that and thought about it, and there are literary artifacts of that sort of intellectual event, and we read that and we think about that as a question, which is a different kind of question from what is the relationship of man to God. Sure, but it nevertheless seems like a big question. Then for me, this form of this is, has that stopped? Is there nothing ongoing that would, in the same way that Descartes and Leibniz and Hobbes come on to the scene, and that seems like a perfectly natural thing in retrospect, how do we talk about that coming to an end? And one of the ways of talking about it is questions. Are there questions that we would confront, or that people 300 years from now will confront, where there might be some literature that would advance the encounter with something real that's happening? And here's the last thing I'll say about it. This is what I tried to emphasize in my little talk. If the answer to that is no, there's a sense in which, do we even need all of these modern authors in the first place? Is maybe the Bible and Plato, maybe Aristotle, maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all we need. Why all these other books? So that's sort of the quandary that I'm trying to confront.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just thinking the question of the level of generality seems, it seems like an interesting question. I guess, it makes me think of the idea of, exhaustiveness. I think the questions, sort of, many of the questions, Mr. Badger gave at the end of his talk seem valuable, but it just seems like the program, I don't know how the program could possibly address every question that's worth addressing, or something like that, I guess. And so I think I don't know, that seems like a real challenge to me. I mean, maybe maybe we hope, or we aim, maybe it's sort of built into seminar, that we read books that in a way every seminar could be different. And I mean, I don't know, I think there are, books that we already read where we can, if we're not thinking about the destructiveness of thermonuclear war, we could still be thinking about the destruction of, in some ways, we can think about the reality of, of war and its devastation and things. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm just, thinking, that it's, they all sound like really good questions. And I don't know, maybe my thought is just, I guess maybe also just to what extent can we pick the questions that are worth discussing? To what extent do, we, students, tutors, come into the discussion bringing what we think are the interesting or important questions that we find something in this reading to help us think about? I don't know, maybe this is another question, I guess.
I was going to ask a question about both of your experiences with students in the classroom, and maybe this is mostly for you in the first instance, Mr. Badger. I thought it might follow from, I take it that our students have on their minds questions like the ones that you ended your remarks with, if not in that exact form, then questions similar to the ones that you yourself presented. And I wonder if it's and I take it that our students are talking about those questions with one another and with tutors. But I wonder if when you hear our students think about those questions, ever find yourself thinking that they're somehow not equipped as fully as they could be to think through those questions, and that part of maybe your interest in giving the account of changes in programs in liberal education in the way that you did is to simply draw our attention to the fact that there will be times, and maybe at all times, students will find themselves not fully equipped with the resources of a program in its sort of current form to make the kind of headway that we want them to make on questions like those. So do you have anything like that experience with students?
Well, the way that you framed it, maybe not in the classroom. One-on-one, I do. Let me preface, anything I say is that I mean this sincerely. This is a real question for me. I don't have an axe to grind. I'm not really sure what the right way forward is. But I do encounter students who maybe chafe at the lack of a context for discussing things that are sort of right in front of our faces. The relationship between men and women in our world is unlike anything in any of the books we read in the program. Is there an account for that? The idea of a pluralistic society, not exactly new in history, but there's a certain, for lack of a better word, a sort of a postmodern version of that. where not only do you have many people living together in the United States, people of different cultures, but those cultures are sort of, we have routine contact with the source of those cultures through mass communication, mass media. So sort of the feverish realities of late stage capitalism, as they say. Is there a way to grapple with that in a serious way, in a theoretical way? Some of this literature that we don't read that might address some of these things is, what's broadly called critical theory. I think in this lecture series, there's some authors who have been referenced to sort of go into these kinds of concerns in a theoretical way that seems interesting. It just seems interesting. So if students could sort of find things that they recognize about themselves in things that they read on that level, I think it could be fruitful. And let me say something else. There are things that are maybe, how to put it, we live in one of the great liberal democracies, and there's an account of what it means to be a constitutional republic. And we read this whole thread of literature, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau. We read the Federalist Papers, the Constitution. We read these Supreme Court cases. And we sort of know the building blocks and the nuts and bolts of what it means to live in a liberal regime. But there is some other kind of gesture. First there was Marxist communism and then Islamic fundamentalism. And maybe there's some kind of, and these are sort of chief competitors to liberal democracy. But then there's the rise of some kind of international cosmopolis that, if Kant writes the Perpetual Peace essay that sort of examines that. Hegel gives us a way of talking about that. But then there are 20th century political writings that sort of thematize this question. What does it mean to go beyond liberalism? What is after liberalism? Or is liberalism sort of the end of the development of politics? So this is one of many sorts of issues that if we don't read these things, they probably won't come up. But if we did read them, they would, and we would be wondering, why weren't we talking about this all along?
I'm just going to make one more remark to see if I can address it to Mr. Coleman, then turn the floor open to questions. I see some Thrasymachus already in the room, eager to get the mic, so Mr. Alginati, be ready. I was actually thinking, Mr. Coleman, tell me if this is right. I guess I was imagining, in response to some of the things that Mr. Badger had just said in the first part of his remarks, about the, say, situation of the sexes at the moment, that there is nothing on the program that gives an account of that, and that seems true. But my intuition was that you might have said, well, that's to sort of ask a question at the wrong level of generality, or sort of too specific a question, and that we have texts in the program that are, of course, thinking about the differences, such as they are, between men and women, and that's in a way enough to pose the question in that form. Would that be a fair way of trying to draw this level of generality contrast that I was trying to work in the first question I asked you?
Yeah, I think so, and I guess I think I also, similarly to Mr. Badger, don't have sort of an answer or a side I'm trying to sort of push for, but I think I also, have this question about to what extent because it seems to me when I read the ancient texts that we read at St. John's that I'm thinking about life today, not exclusively. I'm thinking about, the Almagest. I'm also thinking about, what do we, the world we live in and our perceptions of science and these things. And I think students are as well, I think that's, so it's, I guess I'm just, I don't know. I just thought about, books 5 and 6 of the Republic, I mean, women and, you know, the relationship of the sexes and the way that impacts the city is at least taken up, you know, and I think I sort of said this about the Almagest, that there's a certain kind of freedom, I think, in reading a book and not being tempted to take what I find there, simply apply it to here's the answer. You know, I don't think Socrates in the Republic gives us the answer to how we should see the sexes and their sort of role in society. But I think it's sort of, you know, reading this and discussing it gives us a space to think about it. And I guess that just seems sort of like an interesting thing and an experience that I've had. And just maybe another one that comes to my mind really readily is, you know, in 2000, and when I taught freshman seminar, 2021, we read the Gorgias, and when Gorgias, Socrates is talking to Gorgias about his brother, who's a doctor, and that his brother, the doctor, gives prescriptions, but sometimes people don't want to listen to him and take them. But Gorgias can make them take them. It just was so, like, I couldn't read this without thinking about COVID, without thinking about public health messaging. How in a liberal democratic society, handling a sort of new pandemic, the science unfolding in real time, how do you communicate to your populace? Do you communicate in a way where you simply manipulate them? Or do you try to teach them, which is much harder and way more complicated? And it just seemed to me that discussing the Gorgias is, like, the question was, it seemed right there. It felt incredibly timely reading the Gorgias. I just couldn't, it was kind of shocking to me. And so I guess, just to me, I'm just curious about sort of that aspect to what we do here, that I can read this ancient text and just see, you know, be given this really fruitful sort of perspective on a very timely sort of question that I've been thinking about.
We have about a half hour to take questions from the floor. Yes, please.
Okay.
Stand up, please.
Okay. So I have two questions, actually, but I think it boils down to the same thing, which I think I'm really fascinated by Mr. Badger's talk about, like, how it's been sort of 80 years since our last program text, in the seminar. And I guess for me that goes to what premise the program is founded on. Like, are we, like, in terms of the question of the relationship between men and women, like, I'm really fascinated by that question, and in senior seminar we read The Second Sex, and I feel like that touches on, at least a little bit, a more modern understanding, or, about how we think about the relationship between men and women. And so there's the way of approaching it of, like, what are the questions that we're asking now, and are there texts that help us ask those questions, which is sort of how I was thinking Mr. Badger was going about it. But I also think, like, another way to view the program is, this is going to sound cliche, but as a conversation. Like, a lot of our texts we read, maybe a lot of our students don't think that they're, like, great books, but they influenced everything, or, like, that something like Descartes, if you read closely, it doesn't seem like that was what was picked up. It was just the phrase, I think, therefore I am, and that was what was picked up, and not necessarily the context around it. And so, like, if we're thinking about the tail end of the program, like de Beauvoir and Heidegger, did that conversation end there? Like, I'm curious about this question of, like, is there, like, are we in a dark age? Like, is there something, like, are we trying to now find the origins of this new conversation that we're having? Or is it just a question-based curriculum? Okay, I'm gonna try to clarify because that was very complicated.
No, that made a lot of sense, I think, yeah.
Yeah, I think, just to clarify, is it question-based or is it conversation-based?
Well, maybe I'm not sure I understand. Is it question-based or is it text-based? Is that the question?
Well, I guess I was asking if it's question-based. I mean, you were asking these questions that I think are very interesting currently. And in that case, like, we would try to find texts that would help us answer those questions, especially if, like, we're thinking about Beauvoir as writing at a time when we needed to answer this question, or we needed to think about this question of the relationship between men and women's place in society. Or is it just taking us a long time to find new texts because the texts that are being written right now aren't necessarily being referenced constantly by other important writers currently?
Yeah, I don't know. I do think that there are fundamental questions that, I mean, this is an old controversy, I guess. And different people will say different things about this. I guess I tend to think that at bottom there's a set of questions that we might call fundamental questions. That's the kind of bedrock of what we're up to. And that there are these wonderful books that help us with those questions. So I guess I'm imagining that as sort of the structure of the enterprise. And then, so in this context, the question is it enough? We've got enough books now, and we don't need any more books. And that seems plausible insofar as the fundamental questions sort of have their structure, human life has its form, and we just sail into the future without things really changing. And so then the question is, well, things do seem to be changing, but maybe that seeming is just a kind of superficial change, in which case nothing fundamental is changing. And so we've probably got enough books. But if there are these ruptures, if there's something big that's happening, this world changing, that rival the greatest human questions, then maybe there's a book. Maybe there's a book. So I guess that's sort of the structure of the inquiry that I think is what's operating here.
Do you feel like you need to have an account of rupture in order to sort of like make good on the claim? Or when you sort of are appealing, when you claim, like when you say, if there is a rupture, I think someone wants to then say to you, okay.
What's an example of that?
Well, yeah, make good on that and tell us why it's not just a seeming transformation of the bedrock that has sort of shaped human life for the last howsoever many millennia.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm thinking that a rupture, maybe there are no ruptures, but if they are, what are some examples? And whatever it is that distinguishes the ancients from the moderns, somewhere in there, something big has happened. The dawn of modern science, I think, is some new way of peering into nature that changes the world. I feel pretty confident saying that these would be candidates for ruptures. The motion from a pagan world to a Christian world, or some kind of subsuming of life into a digital form, if such were to happen in the future. Maybe that would be a candidate. Having a lifestyle that wrecks the equilibrium of the ecosphere, maybe that's a rupture of some kind.
Other questions from the floor? We'll go to Mr. Wright since the microphone is very near him, and then after Mr. Wright to this gentleman in the front.
Yeah, kind of following on that question of ruptures, I want to ask what's probably not a helpful question. In Mr. Boyle's initial formulation of this talk, he asked the question, are there distinctly modern phenomena? And of course we use the word modern very loosely, right? Like modern English started in like the 1500s roughly, but we have modern literature starting in like the 20th century. So my question is basically this. Are we still in the modern era? Are we part of something new? And if we are, when did that start? Do you guys have notions of what era are we in now? Sorry.
Well, I like to think that it's still basically the modern era, but some people would say, no, we are in a postmodern era. And we could talk about what that might mean. For what it's worth, but what's at stake here in the question?
Again, the notion of rupture as an indication of a shift into new questions, perhaps, that would require new literature to speak to this question in particular. Literature in the sense of things for us to read.
Yeah, well, I feel like I have to preface this by saying I'm not a historian, so I don't know. But I guess I'm skeptical about the notion of eras. I don't know. I guess when I read ancient books or medieval books or modern books, I think they're much more varied. Societies are much more varied than sort of like these three great epochs of modern, medieval, ancient. I think different parts of the ancient world were probably totally different from each other, and so I don't know. But I think when I read the books, I don't generally. I don't know. I just try to sort of encounter them on their own terms, and I don't know. I mean, I guess the way what I said about reading Ptolemy sort of seems to expand to other things too. That I don't know. I suppose modern science is quite different, but I read Ptolemy and thought he's doing what I was doing when I was studying physics. He's looking at the world. He's making mathematical models that can line up with things that we can see. Obviously, he's doing things. There are a lot of differences, but I think I came into it expecting to see a fundamental difference, and instead was surprised to say, wow, I'd be hard pressed to really pin down sort of anything that I would call a fundamental difference between, what a physicist does today and what Ptolemy did, except just the sort of particulars of the theories we'd find convincing.
Yeah, I guess I would say that there's a fundamental difference, even though it doesn't challenge your claim that reading Ptolemy is timely, and the sort of the beautiful account you gave of we look at the heavens and allow our souls to go into motion with these regular motions of the heavenly bodies, and we're changed by that. That seems correct to me. So it's not a question of Ptolemy not being relevant anymore for very deep reasons. But, strictly speaking, looking to the motion of the heavens and trying to understand them in terms of regular circular motion and reducing it to circles seems fundamentally different from understanding the motion of the planets in terms of laws of motion, and that's made even more vivid by thinking of these motions in terms of curved space-time. So something big has changed in the way we're looking at the motion of the heavens, and I don't know how we want to characterize that change, but I would want to use some word to characterize the change. It's not just more of the same.
Can we bring the mic up to the front for this gentleman here in the blue shirt?
I guess the first question was, is it question-based or discussion-based? And I think Mr. Badger asked if it's question-based or text-based, those questions that we're asking and those conversations that we're having. And I think both of these questions, they're different, but they end up to the same thing. Like, why books? Why texts? I mean, why do we think that those questions that the books try to even propose or deal with are not asked in everyday life to people that don't read those same books, people that just have conversations simply, outside. And it just seems that sometimes, especially for me, it is that these questions are set by the books only. I mean, when I was reading the Almagest, I was like, how can I'm gonna spend 2 semesters reading this incomprehensible thing. How can I make it worth it? Why is it worth it? It seemed that I forced some kind of relevance into it, which honestly, I couldn't find in it. It seemed that it set up the question for me. I had to deal with it because the institution proposed it, right? So why books at all? Why not only conversations about things, I woke up this morning and this happened. Let's discuss about that.
Well, all right, so I'll just say just a little bit. The example you gave makes me think of that you're saying something a little different than I thought you were saying at first, because you could say, why books instead of just topics and questions? But that's different from why books and not just talking about the trivia of our daily life. It could be that there are certain kinds of questions that have a status that would rival, being the foundation of an education in comparison with books.
And those questions are not the questions that we're facing in our everyday life. They have to be brought up through books and...
Well, as a matter of fact, I suppose those are the kinds of questions we're talking about when we ask the question you're asking, I think. Now, you may ask another question, which is, why don't we just chat? Would that sort of lead us to something that is as rich and important as what we currently call liberal education?
Let's go, I see Mr. Halper, and then Mr. Levy.
I was wondering if you had any guesses why 80 years? Why 80 is the number? And I guess just sort of sitting here, I've never thought about this question before, but my initial thought hearing this conversation was, after the Holocaust, there's some sense in which we lose this kind of certainty of of our own judgment. Right? We're not really sure about what's a good book anymore. What's a great book? We can't tell. And we want to go back to the books that we really are quite certain they belong on the program. And so my guess is that there was some kind of rupture and that it's there already, but I'm just making that up. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah, why 80 years? Why did it stop in the 1940s? And if we didn't have the second sex on the program, it would be even longer than that. And it's a very recent addition. So I don't know. I really don't know, but I agree with you that it looks like something happened. Something changed. And this is what I've been trying to emphasize in a lot of the things I'm saying. So it's not that I'm saying, and therefore we should bring books from the 1970s and the 1980s. We should fill in. No, I'm not advocating for that. I'm just saying this is interesting. So if we imagine St. John's College in the year 2205, and they look back and they see all of these books were added and added, all these things built up, and then at World War II, it just stopped. And then for decades and centuries, it just Nothing. Oh, that seems like somebody's got some explaining to do.
Mr. Barbera, did you want to say a quick remark? Mr. Barbera, can I ask you to use the mic and then you...
I'll hold it. This might be superficial, but I'm going to go back to your opening remarks, Mr. Badger and Mr. Coleman. One of you only referred to the seminar, and the other to a book that we read in tutorials. Now, I presume that our liberal education includes both. And it's not been 80 years since we've added something to our tutorials. In fact, it's what, 30 years or something like that. Could it be, now that might be a superficial distinction, but I'm not certain that it is, and that there might be a way in which we would discover important, meaningful texts, not by choosing something and sticking it, not by deciding that we should read Toni Morrison, but rather by thinking about, what constitutes a gene, or what's at stake with entanglement. This would come out of a tutorial probably, and not out of the seminar. And maybe my very general question is, are the tutorials a part of liberal education?
Yes, they are.
Thank you.
But I mean, I take your point, and this seems very important. The tutorials are, this is the nitty-gritty. This is where we're doing, we're working hard at the tutorials to understand languages and to parse and unpack poetry, and to maybe carve into difficult mathematics, and to understand physics and biology. So it is only natural. I mean, there's a way in which we can't avoid it. It would be strange, for example, if we ended our laboratory work in the 17th or 18th century. It seems obvious that we would we'd see how the story plays out with gravitation, with the structure of matter, with the motion, the study of motion, then force, and then energy. This is right there in front of us, and so it seems uncontroversial to take it on. But philosophy seems somehow different. And one argument, and this gets maybe to the question of why the 80-year gap. One might argue, well, these innovations in the natural sciences and mathematics are all well and good, but philosophy really did stop with Heidegger. There is no more philosophy. So, and for better or worse, seminar seems to be a place where philosophy actually is on the menu. But it's not just philosophy. So we do read novels in seminar. So why, when I confront the question about poetry and novels, I don't have a good answer for why seminar gets left out.
Mr. Levy, right behind Mr. Barbera, if you would, and then we'll go to Mr. Goldsmith. You also have a question? And then Mr. Goldsmith.
All right, well, thank you. Hello. I'm curious why singing is such an important part of a liberal education, and if we should pay as much mind to the songs we choose to sing as opposed to the books we choose to read, and how that is maybe developed throughout liberal education in St. John's.
Well, I'll say some things about that. The songs we choose to sing is the way you put it.
Yes, as though there seems to be, songs that all freshmen sing in chorus, and we pay mind to the books everyone reads in the order they read them. I'm curious if we should pay as much mind to the songs we sing and maybe the order in which we sing them. It's certainly an essential part of the Johnny education.
I'm sure we should be thoughtful about it. I think that it's a little bit, it's not as difficult a question when you put it in terms of freshman chorus, because the freshmen have to learn to read music, they have to learn to sing, they have to work together and they need to be prepared for what's going to happen in sophomore music. So that might restrict them to some degree. You might ask, well, why don't they sing folk songs and rock music, or I don't know. I don't know that would, I think it's kind of okay that they learn to do what they need to do for sophomore music. But the version of your question that is sort of interesting for me is we go through St. Matthew Passion, Don Giovanni, Tristan and Isolde. One could imagine The Rite of Spring or Bartok string quartets. And I hesitate to go much further than that. I don't want to make myself a laughingstock. But there's interesting music in the late 20th century, early 21st century. So that's the version of this that I think might at some point emerge. Maybe not today. Surely by 2205.
Yeah, I think I'm just thinking the way this connects to Mr. Barbera's question about the tutorials and the seminar. It is a sort of interesting and maybe a different question from the one that we've been discussing. Right? We've been thinking about the things we read in seminar, but we can also think about the fact that we have music, laboratory, mathematics, and language in addition to seminar, and whether that choice is subject to change, and to what extent, what role does music play there? It just seems like I think I also agree, of course, we should be thoughtful, and I'm sure are thoughtful about the things that we sing, but also there's just a fact of singing together that is sort of is a phenomenon to be experienced, and that I think helps constitute a community. That when we sing together, we do something that we all are producing, and it produces one whole thing from many different people and different voices. And I don't know, I was thinking this the other day, doing the singing in the Pendulum Pit on Tuesdays that we've been doing. Anyone? It's a good bass. We need good basses. But I was thinking, just to what extent is, when we sing together, is it similar in the classroom, in the seminar and tutorials, what we're doing? I think the discussions that we have when we read books, it is a sort of one thing happening coming from many of us, that we're all working together towards it. It's not 15 independent activities happening around the table, and that's the thought I had.
I think we have time for two more questions. So I see maybe three, because I see Ms. Price. So Mr. Goldsmith, Mr. Rogalski, and then we'll go to Ms. Price. But keep them short.
I'll do my best. So I want to go back to something Mr. Coleman said a little while back, that say when we're reading The Republic and seeing the treatment of the sexes there, hopefully we're not just taking the answer provided or the conclusion provided and just accepting that as true. We're challenging it with our own thoughts and getting into a conversation with Plato. And there's something that's very right about this, that maybe helps answer a question asked earlier, that the books provide us a kind of guide to the fundamental questions that we want to address. And the different books do it in different ways. But I think the setup of just Plato and his answer to a question, and then us on the other side, doesn't quite capture the whole picture, because the books, the authors, provide a possibility space within they situate that answer, or that conclusion that they draw. And the books will, on the same question, draw the possibility spaces differently. And so one worry I have about not trying to keep up in some way is that we are missing some of the possibility spaces within which to situate not just new answers, but old answers, so that we're not thinking about differences across the periods in history. So, of course, there are differences within what we think of as historical eras. There are also those differences across those eras. So, for example, right, Heidegger is drawing up the possibility space differently than Plato is. And it could be that there are philosophers now drawing up the possibility space differently than Heidegger did and differently than Plato did that would be interesting to us. But we'd have to be open to reading those. And with questions like gender or technology, if it is a somewhat new phenomenon, or there are differences in the way that things appear to us now and appear to people before, the possibility space will be different, right? And we need a guide to help us think about that possibility space. What is essential? What's not essential? So anyway, this is just, like the question here is, right, do we think that if we think that some books are just addressing fundamental questions, and that it's sufficient to just read those, say, few books. I mean, Mr. Badger, you mentioned earlier, just, what was it, the Bible and Plato and Aristotle or something like that. I worry, and I wonder if you share this worry, that we lose some description of possibility spaces that are different.
Am I understanding you're worried that we would lose possibilities if we're restricting our questions to things that we would find in the books?
Not necessarily questions, but the way the books approach drawing the possibility space within which they situate their answers or worlds. Yeah.
Yeah. So where does that point? Does that suggest we should not look so closely to the books as we explore these questions, or does it mean more books is better than fewer books?
This consideration tends to point me in the direction of needing to pay attention to newer books or others. No, I agree with that too. Yeah.
Can you, Mr. Castle, can you just say it louder what you're saying, and maybe to the microphone? And
there may be worthwhile possibilities explored or established in books that we haven't read that were written thousands of years ago. So I think the wealth of philosophy that's in texts anywhere, I mean, I guess it's always growing, but it's probably not growing by a lot. I think we're always just going to end up with a sliver. And I don't think that the timeliness question doesn't seem that pertinent to me. I mean, I think there's a 700-year gap at a certain point between two sophomore seminar readings, suggesting to students that nothing great was written for 700 years. That's obviously no one thinks that, but that's the hard we're dealt.
I'm going to give these two gentlemen at the podium, at the table, the last word, and then I'm sorry to say it to Ms. Price and Mr. Rogalski that I just invite you to come up after they have the last word to ask more questions here. Please, Mr. Badger, Mr. Coleman.
What's the question?
No question. Just you have the opportunity to say any final words, anything come to mind in response to what Mr. Caswell had just said.
I agree with what Mr. Caswell just said, if I understood everything. I think there's going to be some way in which it might go back to a question that was asked earlier, why books at all? And this is what we have in the sketch that we get in Plato's Republic, where we don't address books or even questions, but there are just these topics of inquiry which we drill into. So I guess this opens up to what we're up to in a great books program. I mean, it's easy to sort of conflate great books with liberal education, and I do think they go great together, but I'm not sure they're the same thing.
Yeah, and I guess just my last thought, what Mr. Goldsmith was asking, and also with what Mr. Caswell was saying, it just seems to me that I don't think that the books we read on the program together for any of us are the only books that we read. I hope that's not the case. I certainly think, I said this earlier, I don't think the program can possibly be exhaustive of all the books worth reading or all the thoughts worth, thinking about in fundamental ways. And possibly, and maybe this is something we could also discuss, or maybe when we break, people can chat about it. Like, that the program can't be everything, and that in some ways, hopefully, maybe it helps us to reach out and to do things that aren't already there in the program, so that that it is a living inquiry that we have going on in our lives, and that the trees aren't dead and stopped growing 80 years ago or something, even if our seminar list doesn't yet include any of them. So I don't know.
Please join me in thanking Mr. Badger and Mr. Coleman. To ask questions and didn't get a chance to, please, I hope we can continue talking here in the hall, somewhere else as well. Thank you all for coming. Thanks, Jim. Patrick, thanks, man. Thank you. You did an awesome job.
Yeah, no, that was
awesome job. Thanks. Yeah. I had included in my remarks that I said, like, thanks to Jonathan and Patrick, especially Patrick. I left this out because I basically commandeered him in the hallway one day after he had said, look, I don't think that you asked this question in a good way. I said, that's awesome. I'm so glad that you didn't pick that.